Ronnie, welcome back to the show. You must be very proud of your country. There have been many things to be proud of as a South African, but this is up there with the liberation itself, isn't it?
Absolutely, George. It's absolutely wonderful. We are so proud of our country, of our government. It's gone through a rough time. I've been very critical of it at times, as you well know, George. But my God, in terms of the stand that we've taken and the applause we're receiving, although the stand hasn't been for that. And I certainly don't mind if the great Yemeni people win your award instead of the South African legal team. But we're really so proud of this country. We've regained something of the excitement and the intensity with which we were viewed by progressive people throughout the world when we managed to overthrow the apartheid beast, which of course the Palestinian people will do so one day in relation to their land. We're absolutely sure of that. But it's been too long since I've seen you. And, you know, if I can say this to your audience, because I don't think many people know, but you're an honorary member of our underground in South Africa, because you were one of those internationalists, a London recruit. We called them the ones who came from or were recruited from the UK, who came out to South Africa and assisted us in that time. And it's a little example of international solidarity. So it's not simply the question of the stand that the government has taken in terms of challenging Israel and charging it with genocide, but it's a question of doing it, yes, for the Palestinian people, people of Gaza and the West Bank, the Palestinians everywhere in the refugee camps within Israel itself, and so on, in the diaspora. But it is a mighty stand for humanity, a mighty stand for humanity. And I'm very pleased you asked me to interact with you at this particular time.
I was a very small time soldier. You were my commander, along with people like Joe Slovo, Ruth First, Dennis Goldberg, Albie Sachs, and of course the perspicacious amongst the audience will have noted that everyone I've just mentioned there were Jewish opponents of apartheid. That's one of the great piquancies, isn't it? As I once said at the Oxford Union, Jews don't have to be with apartheid. The African National Congress was filled with and led by Jewish enemies of apartheid. It's something special, that, isn't it?
Well, for sure, it was a very small minority, though, of the Jewish community in South Africa, dominated by Zionism, an enemy of ours from the time I joined as a 20-year-old, needing information, needing understanding, needing political consciousness, coming from a Jewish background. And what I learned very soon, George, from the veterans, black and white, Christians in origin as well as Jews, who were there, was that Israel was a tool of US imperialism, and that being Jewish was not synonymous with having to support Zionist Israel or being a Zionist. And what we also need to point out is in that period of apartheid, the Zionist Federation and the Jewish Board of Deputies in South Africa castigated the few Jews, because we were a few, a good grouping around the country, and we were traitors. They would have nothing to do with us, and they projected us in that light to their community, to their offspring, that we were dangerous, we were no good. And I can tell you, although there was a brief honeymoon, which none of us enjoyed when we came out of the underground or from exile, and certain Jewish leaders, including a chief rabbi who had come out from Britain, from your Scotland, a dreadfully conservative person, actually, who was buttering up to Madiba, to Mandela. And for a very brief moment, they wanted to bask in our sun. And the moment they saw that we were condemning Israel, we were again absolute traitors. And the viciousness today has grown as it has in Israel in terms of this absolute inevitability of any doctrine based on race, on racism. It's inclined, as Afrikaner nationalism was, as is happening in Israel, to go more and more to the extremes. And what we're seeing, of course, today is a fascism in Israel. And what we're seeing among Zionists around the world is that kind of poison. Although they don't wear jackboots and use the Nazi salute, but in terms of their racism and the measures they take and their lack of humanity, and they cry about 136 or 9 who are people who are kept by the resistance within Gaza, or 1,100 or so who they claim in terms of numbers were butchered by the resistance on the 7th of October, although half of the people were mown down and killed by the berserk Israeli death force. And the Zionists in this country swallow every single word, and they pollute their offspring. And we've seen this happening in Nazi Germany, in fascism everywhere, and of course in Israel, where a good friend of both of ours, Gideon Levy, I was watching one of his interviews the other night, was basically saying left or right in Israel, and of course left in quotes, are exactly the same when it comes down to the issue of the survival and the doings of this Zionist apartheid colonial settler state. So it's been absolutely awful in terms of what's happened to Jewish people, because in that time, that no matter the minority we were that I referred to, you could find in certain numbers that humanity. And for a while, and certainly in Israel, it's gone out the window, and it has in South Africa. But I was pointing out in a debate last night that we've so welcomed the small grouping of young Jewish people in our country, incomparable to what we'll see in the UK and certainly in the US. But we've got those righteous Jews here, and they've emerged, and they stand up and they proclaim not in their name. And it's been so stimulating, inspiring to humanity and to, of course, the people of Gaza and Palestine, at the numbers of Jews who are involved in the protests, the occupation of so many vital points in America, Grand Central Station, etc., etc. But I don't want to dwell on that, because it's not just Jewish. I mean, I'm born Jewish. They say that I've converted to Islam because I've married a woman who's not actually an intense believer. This is after the death of my wife, who you've paid so much tribute to in your life, George, Eleanor, who was a Scots-born, a one-year-old who came to South Africa, Protestant background. She was a freedom fighter. And we've got to recognize that it's not simply the few Jewish people. Of course, it's important to proclaim it, because if I can just go on a little, George, when a small group of whites, Jews, Christians, communists, socialists in South Africa, a very small number, a couple of hundred or so, we were regarded by the apartheid regime with such venom. And the reason is because we called out the myth of racism, the myth that the whites all had to stand together for survival and had nothing to do with the rest of the country, with Black South Africa. In the same way, we see this in terms of Israel and how they tried to dragoon all the Jews in the world behind their flag. And it's very important that we're able to show the myth of that. But what's much more important, George, is the numbers of people of humanity, global South, global North, humanity everywhere, as you never fail to point out how we are humanity. Amen. We are the many, they are the few, those wonderful words of English literature from one of our famous poets who we both love, Shelley, Red Shelley. Indeed. And that applies everywhere. And this is why Israel has lost whatever is happening on the day-to-day butchery of people of Palestine. They are winning. They are winning for the obvious reason that humanity is with them, that they're fighting a just war, a righteous war, and they will win in the international solidarity of a young George who is prepared to come out to South Africa and carry out a mission. The example of that resonates in the millions and millions who stand by the people of Palestine and oppressed people everywhere. So it's a wonderful time we see. Amen. With all the beastly tragedy in terms of the butchery and what the price the Palestinians are paying. But they're winning. They'll win this war, George, as you and so many others so eloquently put it.
Amen. We've only time for one more question, though I could talk with you all night. The multi-colored, multi-ethnic, multi-religious rainbow legal team have entered the consciousness and the hearts of people all over the world. I declare an interest, as someone whose mother is Irish, in the beautiful summing up of the Irish lawyer, but we had black South African lawyers, white South African lawyers, Muslim South African lawyers. It was South Africa at its very best. The South Africa we fought for, Ronnie. It was the South Africa we dreamed of that we saw at The Hague, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, George, with the domination and its passing, and I'm not saying, therefore, that we're winning the world battle tomorrow and next month and next year, but the waning power of imperialism, of the former colonial powers, the collective West that's buckling, what we're able to show in that unity and in that outstanding young Irish jurist who's stolen all our hearts. And all of them are so outstanding, including our own South African John Dugard, who I knew back in the 50s, and we were very close. in relation to the Congress of Democrats, which was a small white group that Joe Slovo, Ruth First, and others had actually established. So it's a whole range there, and it's multinational. It represents humanity, and they did an outstanding job. I want to just, if we've got a moment, to add how this is embracing humanity, because look at the stand that small Namibia, a nation of 2 million, who suffered from the genocidal onslaught of Germany in 1904, exactly 120 years ago to the month, and how they've come out to condemn the stand of Germany in supporting Israel in terms of the genocide that Israel is guilty about. So this is something that is exploding everywhere, and it's going to increase. And I must say, your introduction in relation to the brave Yemenis, almost the Cubans, as, by the way, resistance from Hezbollah to Hamas, and I'll say that no matter how people might regard it, because the jury's still out in terms of what actually happened on the 7th of October, and the fact of the way, as I mentioned earlier, the Israeli death force is responsible for at least half of those people who were killed. And who knows what kind of evidence they were creating at the murder scenes in terms of building up the hysteria which they needed to go on the onslaught in terms of biblical tradition, as we've heard from that butcher of theirs, Netanyahu, in quoting the Amalekites. And that's a nail in their coffin in terms of the genocide case. But can I just quickly say on the outcome, whatever the outcome, George, we've won. We've won in the court of public opinion. That's been won. You can never be sure what happens, as you well know, what happens in the minds of judges and the technicalities they can bring out in terms of standing against what is an obvious evidence. So from that point of view, I have certain concerns. We're all hoping, and at least hoping that interim approach in terms of the risk of genocide, because it's an interim action, that can bring about the results we're all looking for. Because the issue, as the Yemenis are showing, and people like you for decades have shown, that the Palestine issue is at the moral center of what's happening in the world. And Nelson Mandela made that very statement, George. You'll know all about that.
I think you've just won the vote for South Africa, with all respect to our Yemeni friends. Ronnie Kasrils, I love you with all my heart. May God preserve you, and may we still be talking to each other a decade from now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, George. Thanks for having me.
Of all talk shows. You brought a tear to my eye.